Welcome to the podcast of All Means All. In this episode, Josefine Wagner, Özge Özdemir, Lina de Barros, and Sam Blanckensee will talk about identity politics, labeling in education.
Can you please introduce yourself?
So my name's Sam, I use they and he pronouns. I'm part of the trans community. I identify as non-binary, as well as neurodivergent, which is kind of a new identity that I've kind of only learned about myself. I'm a vet nurse by training. I'm the equality officer in a university. I also really describe myself as an activist, a family member, a partner. Yeah, that's probably enough to begin with.
My name is Danielle. I have cerebral palsy. I never say I suffer from cerebral palsy because I don't suffer. I either say I have or I live with cerebral palsy. When defining myself, I would probably say I'm a self-advocate, and I advocate for the rights of other disabled people, and for people that don't have that voice, I'll be that voice.
I'm Özge, and I'm a sociology student from Frankfurt. I am an activist and I'm an educator in the field of anti-discrimination and anti-racist work in Germany. And I'm working, or I used to work a lot with friends and families who were affected by a racist attack, or whose family members or friends were murdered in a racist attack in Germany.
How would you describe your identity? How do you identify yourself?
So for me, my identity is wrapped up in many different parts of me. So I guess a lot of my identities I've come to at quite a later age than many. So kind of finding words to describe queerness and then eventually transness. But also in Ireland, it's quite unusual to have, well, it's not unusual to mix religious heritage, but it's unusual to have some Jewish heritage. So for me, my identity has always been wrapped up in feeling other, feeling outside of, feeling different than. And it's only as I went through school and then eventually found the language myself that I started to find my place in society and how it fit me to interact. So learning I was trans was a huge change in terms of me being comfortable interacting with other people. Like, I never thought I wanted to work with anything to do with people, because people were never easy for me to engage with. But now my entire role involves people interacting with others, being a self-advocate and advocating for my community and others. So it's identity for me has been something that's progressively changed over time, and I'm always learning about.
For me, if I'm describing myself, I always describe myself by using other things like my crazy hair colours, my dress sense, although it's quite mild today, or my tattoos, or my sense of humour, and then almost as an afterthought, I will say, oh yeah, I have cerebral palsy, because cerebral palsy is only a small part of who I am. It's not insignificant, because without it, I wouldn't be the person I am. But it doesn't define me, and I'm also aware that other people or other disabled people aren't able to voice that. So I have a passion for disabled people in general to be able to embrace their own identity, whatever that might be, and to advocate for the fact that identity doesn't need to be just an appearance, it can be in all aspects of your life. So I've even put my identity on my wheelchair, on my seating covers, because I use the wheelchair daily, so you could arguably say that that's an extension of my identity, or you might be able to add it to your home decor, or your taste in music, or just your sense of humour, or just in general your outlook in life. So identity can be so individualised, but means so much more than just appearance.
I think I would say the same. I think I would say that I can't really now tell everything about my identity, or I'm sure I couldn't catch the complexity of it. And I would also say that I have certain traits like, I think I'm quite a loving person, or I care about other people, or I can also be funny, and these are all traits or things which are part of my identity. And I think in being born in Germany and raised up there, I was still children of a Kurdish migrant family. So I would say I would identify myself as a woman of color, and also as Kurdish, even though I'm socialized in Germany. But I think there's so many other parts of me that will still evolve, but are also there, which this video can't catch.
What are your experiences with labels or labeling in your school experience?
Yeah, I did think quite a lot about this, because I guess the labels I had weren't always really visible, and probably quite different to the experience of specifically Danielle. Yours is probably very different to mine. The main one for me that maybe didn't fit was the label of girl. Something that I guess, especially for teachers, you're probably not thinking so much when you say, oh, boys and girls, can you line up? Or boys and girls pay attention, which was always kind of the way that it was said in school. So like actually the label of gender from a very young age is something that when I started to realize it more, I realized how uncomfortable I was with it and how uncomfortable it made me. So I guess a lot of my labels would have been invisible or in the norm, or seen to be in the norm. And then it's only as I got older that I realized that those labels had always boxed me in a place that I really wasn't.
I think due to my disability, labels was something, as Sam indicated, that I was used to from a very young age, and before I was aware of it, my parents obviously had to become used to the sort of labelling that comes with a medical diagnosis. So you would hear things like, or growing up I heard doctors say, Danielle has spastic cerebral palsy. Now that first word is even a horrible word and should never be used anyway, but it has been in medical descriptions for a long time. So I think it's difficult when you live or you're faced with labels of medical diagnosis before you even reach milestones like going to school and progressing through school and I don't know, maybe that's why now as an adult, maybe that's not an underlying reason that maybe I do dye my hair crazy colours, or I choose bright outfits to make a statement and to be identified as something other than a medical label. But I think within that, or most recently as an adult, I was at training, and one of my colleagues did a task, and it was called Introducing Yourself Better. So that focuses on thinking, okay, so who am I? I'm Danielle, I'm a sister, I'm a daughter, I'm a friend, I'm a colleague, and through all these things, it's nothing to do with cerebral palsy and everything to do with who I am. So being able to be part of that exercise made me reflect and actually realise that, yeah, that should be how I'm introducing myself. Nothing to do with disability.
Yeah, I think in the same way, and for me it was that like school was not a good experience for me, or it was very exclusionary for me, and I got labels that I think also were then like massive stones in my pathway, or I had to really work on them. And it was that I always that I was labeled as different in the way of I am not German, even though I was born in Germany. So I was always the child of immigrants, and so this label was also connected to firstly my class. So it was my family is a workers' family. So it was, and I'm the first one who was studying out of that family. So it was always like, it's going to be too difficult for you. You should not try to have like, I don't know, to go into university or to have another degree or whatever. So it was always like, labeling me as the immigrant child who will not make it, basically. That was like one label I had, and which basically put me down all the time. Plus, I was also labeled a lot of times in a wrong way, and I thought it was that way because that's basically like the assimilation history of my family, that I grew up thinking that I'm Turkish or that my family is Turkish, even though we are Kurdish. That's a massive difference, and I was always labeled as the Turkish one or the Turkish child, but I always also thought that it's true. And I think later on I understood, okay, actually this label was wrong, but it was getting stronger, or I believed in it even more stronger because my teachers also supported that.
So experiences with identities can be quite complex. Sometimes it can feel empowering to identify with groups or labels, and sometimes disempowering or even deep feelings of rejections. Would you like to share your experiences?
Yeah, so I guess for me as a trans person, coming out is terrifying. And you have to like really have a strong sense of identity and who you are in order to bring other people into that identity. And it's really, really challenging because you have to show other people how to treat you, changing your name, changing the pronouns they call you. But for me, also finding that identity was both affirming and knowing who I am myself, and in finding a community of people. So finding the trans community and finding the LGBT community for me was going, oh, okay, there are other people like me. This is a place that I can be different and fit in, because I still think the differences that I have are really important, but this is a place where difference is important and accepted. I think for me, the neurodivergent piece is similar. Again, figuring out how my mind works and just going, oh, okay, this is why I've struggled with this forever. These are tools that I can use to help me struggle less or be less frustrated. But at the same time, I have also faced quite a lot of rejection, but also just rejection of other identities that I have. So before I transitioned, before I realized I was queer, I was really involved with the Catholic Church. And really from my own feelings of, and seeing what the church was saying about me and people like me, I stopped being involved at all. So I haven't really gone anywhere near the church since I was about 16, even though I would have been there 2-3 times a week before that point. Part of it was a decision that I didn't agree with what was said there, but part of it was not feeling like I would be accepted or could be accepted for who I was in that space.
I think for me, with my disabilities, some of my experiences are similar to Sam's, but also different. So, for example, I'm often faced with assumptions. So people will see the disability and they will assume that. So they have to talk to my personal assistant or whoever's with me, or like one I face regularly is, say for example, somebody wants to come, I don't know, to my house to do a repair, and I say, no, you can't come that day because I'm actually out working. And they'll go, oh, so you work? Yeah, just because I sit in a chair, in a wheelchair, doesn't mean I'm unable to work or to contribute to society. But at the same time, whilst I have a lot of disabled friends, and I think similar to what Sam said, I feel comfortable in that space because obviously my friends and colleagues who also have disabilities can empathise and understand where I'm coming from. But at times, for me personally, and this is just a completely personal view and feeling, I also don't like just being with disabled people, because if you go out in a group of disabled people or a group of wheelchair users, for example, it suddenly feels like a convoy of people rather than just being out in a group. I suppose my view is similar but also different to yours.
I think for me it was really important, like growing up, having this process of who am I, and I think I'm still asking myself that question, and I think it might change also in the future. But I think for me, finding especially other Kurdish women who were socialized in Germany and who could kind of understand, or not only understand my experiences, but maybe also feel it. I mean, that emotional level of that I feel that person understands what I went through, or basically what consequences racism had for my life. So that I think that emotional level of connecting with other people, because we share certain experiences which are linked to our biographies or to our life, I think that made the difference to me, and not somebody who says, I can understand you, okay, you can understand me, but can you feel, or have you been through the same pain I have been through? And I think it's not only the pain which connects other Kurdish women to me, but also basically us fighting against racism, or fighting for our place in society and fighting for our identity. And these are not only painful things, but also nice things to celebrate our culture, our history, our music, our dresses, whatever it can be or is part of it, our colors. So I think that perspective is really important for me, that it's not only the negative aspects which connect you to your community, it is also, or mostly for me, it's the positive aspects.
Okay. Looking back at your school experience, what would you have needed from your teacher back then?
Personally, I would have needed language. I would have needed information. I didn't realize what I was feeling was being trans. I knew I didn't fit in. I didn't know that that's what that meant. So more information at a younger age would have been really what I needed, was support in realizing that what I was feeling was transness. And also, I think, as somebody assigned female at birth, there is a lack of recognition of neurodiversity in people in ADHDers of young ages. So there's a lot of people I know who are diagnosed in their 20s, that if they were assigned male at birth, they would have been diagnosed at 10, because it looks very different. And so just a bit more awareness of them, of what neurodiversity might look like, especially when somebody maybe is getting the grades that they're expected to get, but isn't knowing how to socialize, isn't knowing how to speak to other people. And that would have really, like for me, just the lack of knowledge is what I miss. And then when I did come out, when I did transition, I had a really difficult time. I was in a Catholic all-girls school and stayed in a Catholic all-girls school until I finished. And my teachers did not know how to cope at all with somebody who was transitioning, who wanted to not wear the school uniform, and that was the focus. The focus was that I had to keep wearing the school uniform, not on how I was getting on, whether everything was okay at home. Like, my parents and I weren't really getting on very well, and I was trying to finish my schooling. But it wasn't about supporting me, it was about making sure I followed the school rules. I will say, the school that I was in has changed a lot in the past 11 years since I graduated. And now there are trans men who are out in the school who can wear trousers, and anyone can wear trousers in the school. There are people in the local, traditionally all-boys school who are trans women and who've transitioned within that school and are comfortable and feel safe. And so things have changed and it's more okay, but my experience could have really been made much better by caring about me rather than about the hierarchy and institutional rules.
I think for me, in education, looking back, my primary school years were probably relatively okay for that time, in the sense that I went to a mainstream school, so and because I was friends with some of my friends before I started school, they didn't see the wheelchair, they just seen Danielle, which was how it should have been. But that changed when I started when I was approaching the end of primary school and moving into secondary school, because my friends were starting to do things that I couldn't do, and it was becoming more obvious that I couldn't do it. Like when you're younger, it's easier to be lifted or onto a bus for a school trip, or if you don't need equipment because you can be assisted because you're only small. But as you start to grow, these kind of accessibility issues become more apparent. So I couldn't go on school trips or go to sleepovers or things like that because of access issues. So when I was moving from primary school to secondary school, I made the choice, with the support of my parents, to move into special education, although I personally dislike that term, but again, that's just a personal viewpoint. So I moved into that educational environment, which at that time was the only special school in Scotland that followed the mainstream curriculum. So I went on to achieve the same qualifications as my peers who are not disabled, just in a different environment with the additional support I needed to do so. But for me, one of the main reasons that because the education department were keen for me to stay in mainstream by the time I got to secondary school age, because when I was starting primary school, my parents had to fight to get me into mainstream primary because apparently my cerebral palsy was going to make me disruptive. I can be disruptive, but for other reasons, nothing to do with the disability. So by the time I got to secondary school, they had done a full circle, and they believed that me moving into special education would shield me from the real world, when in fact it did the exact opposite and encouraged me to go back into mainstream education for my to move back into college and then to uni again. But for me it was that, I guess similar to you, Sam, that awareness and that education and being able to adapt environments to what I needed rather than me not fitting with what was available, which then caused me to feel I had no other option but to go to special education to achieve the qualifications that I have.
I think for me, it's kind of the same. I think I would have needed teachers or educators who are actually, who see me and, or that I would have felt like seen by them and heard by them. And by that I mean that if I tell them my needs as a student or my wishes, that they would take me seriously and basically value my perspective. And I think it would have helped to not have the feeling I am constantly put into a box. I think that I had that feeling a lot, that people were saying, oh, you are very good in this, but you are not that good in this. Or you should try this, but don't try this. So I think if it would have been more open for me, I could have found myself more, or I could have had the opportunity of that process of finding myself, or my strengths, my weaknesses, whatever. So I think, for me it would have been that support, and depending on my needs, the action of the teachers. So basically looking at your surrounding, okay, what do you need? What do you need to learn in a good way? What do you need to feel valued and seen and respected? And yeah, and I think this also contributes to a dynamic or an atmosphere of trust. And I think from a very young age, I think I lost that trust in school to my teachers, or yeah, I think I gained that only with the support of my peer students. And I think that was the only thing which said to me, oh, you can do it. You can actually, yeah, you can actually make it.
Did you have any positive experience in schools?
So I probably would have had, I had some positive experiences with certain teachers who were kind of people I could speak to about kind of struggles around identity, particularly when I was kind of realizing I was queer in a very Catholic environment. Probably the most positive I had around identity was in primary school around kind of that Jewish heritage, where like my teacher supported my dad coming in to do a Passover meal around that time of year, so that I could show some of my culture within the school setting, and it was something everyone else really enjoyed. I mean, I think there's some really interesting memories of kids going and spitting out parsley with salt water in the bathrooms, and everyone getting very dramatic about that. But it was great for me to be able to kind of show that part of my culture that nobody else kind of understood or could see. So that was really nice. So that kind of celebration was lovely.
Despite the sort of more challenging things that happened while I was at school, I did have positive experiences, but again, similar to what you said, Sam, it sometimes depended very much on the teacher and how they approach things and their sort of value set, if that's probably the best way of describing it. But things like I more than once got the lead role in the school play because I was very good at remembering lines, and that had nothing to do with the fact that I sat in a wheelchair. It was more to do with the fact that I had a good memory, and things like, and because I already had friends prior to starting primary school that just saw Danielle, on the whole, that filtered through. So when I was mixing with my peers in the playground, they would adapt games that I could play or played games that I could join in. So I think it goes back to what we said earlier about it being a lot to do with your peers. I think it was a similar experience for me.
I think for me it was in secondary school. Well, I don't really remember a lot of primary school, but in secondary school I had the feeling that my class teacher, she was like, yeah, she was believing in me and like trying always to motivate me and trying to find ways in how I would understand the content of the subjects. And I had the feeling she was like really supportive and always telling me, you can do it and you will make it. And she would also like criticize herself or telling me like, or maybe it's on me that I have to find other ways of telling you or making you learn it better, and it's nothing about you. So I wouldn't feel like, oh, okay, the problem is me and I can't do it, but it's just you need another version or another method to let the students learn the content better. I think that was like the most important one to felt valued and that somebody believed in me and was pushing me like forward. And I also have the feeling that it's very much about specific teachers who can make a great and a big impact on your school experience. And there's not maybe a lot of them, but even one, I think, can be a big change in where you want to go or how you believe in yourself or even how you think about yourself.
So why do we talk about labeling and identity politics?
So I come at this topic from the perspective of a teacher educator. For me, it's always important to tell my students who want to become teachers that learning and who I am or who I want to be known as in the world is really closely interwoven. So if my students want to learn how to teach kids, I would want them to understand that that identity is not just a variable or something you can pick and choose, but it is an integral part of who we are. And in order to feel motivated to participate and engage in the classroom, there has to be space to be my full personhood.
Yeah, so and as an activist, I'm very thankful for this perspective because in my experience also, becoming a teacher, identity didn't play a role in the curriculums. And but as a self-advocate for LGBTIQ rights and a white passing woman of color, I have experienced discrimination and I've always stumbled across identity and questions and issues that are related to identity. So I have always worked on it in activist circles, but also academically I have been interested in it. And I see my colleagues at school, at secondary school, struggling. And so there are many cases and many conflicts that arise, that some of them could have been prevented and some of them could have been mediated more easily if you as a teacher had a broader concept of or more knowledge about the processes of identity construction and the existential pain, crises, power that comes with them.
I would say the most important part about it is basically to understand as an educator or as a teacher that the students which are in class have complex identities or also multi-layered identities. And I think we will never be at the point to understand all of the parts of identities people have, or maybe they also will not share it with us, or they don't want to share it with us. But I think it's important to have an awareness of that people are not just don't always just have one identity, but they have multiple ones. And they have visible ones and they have not visible ones. And I think if you have this awareness or the knowledge over that, you can create a learning room where students will feel valued and respected, and also you will be able to protect them in case they face structural violence or structural discrimination or even interpersonal discrimination. And I think a big responsibility of an educator is to see how can I also protect students in my classroom and ensure a dynamic or an atmosphere where they can find themselves or define themselves without labeling them from outside.
Yeah, I think my work as an equality officer, often people assume that I'm trying to get everyone treated exactly the same. And I think without us talking about identity in a classroom, in an institution perspective, that's what we end up with, is that, okay, everyone is exactly the same because identity doesn't exist in this space. But that's not possible. Everyone is navigating a society that always categorizes, that always splits us into groups. And by bringing that into a classroom discussion, we acknowledge it and we allow for the strength that comes in identity and knowing yourself and feeling power in yourself, and also enables us to see where certain identities have less power and the dynamics of society put certain people's back, and we can then protect against that.
Yeah. So I remembered an example from school where a group of otherwise very well adjusted girls who are friends, excellent, like overachievers, were suddenly found split into different groups, shouting at each other in the courtyard. And like one group, like they ganged up. It was like a mob. And one group was shouting, if you don't respect LGBTQ rights, we don't respect your religion. And the other group started to shout, you're racists, and Allahu Akbar. So how are you going to deal with this as a teacher? How are you going to understand what actually happened and what led to this situation? How could this have been prevented and how can this be mediated? If you have no idea about identity, labeling, identity politics, racism, discrimination, how can you deal with the complexity of that particular situation? So that's why we want to encourage everybody to get through the theory, because that will really affect your ability to analyze the everyday situations, the complexity of everyday situations. Yeah. So what is identity and how does it work?
So society has changed very quickly, and many of the shared belief systems that people have had over many years with shared stories and narratives have changed in society. So, for example, the way families work, nations, religions, and for example, the gender binary. And these were once shared by many, many people. And recently, these have been deconstructed or drastically changed. And this has happened for many, many reasons. So, for example, globalization, how quick society is now, the amount of information available online, and how knowledge has been produced, as well as migration and migration movements, just to say some of them. And many of these concepts then have been criticized and challenged as these changes have happened within society. Through the crackling then of those concepts, people have had the chance to redefine themselves and choose their identities. And those identities can be multi-layered and also contradict each other. It's important to bear in mind that there are simply more resources available for some people to construct their identities than others. And that's why identity construction is not only an individual's choice, but rather dependent on structural access that you have to resources. So for example, if you're a queer person who lives at home with your family, it may not be safe for you to express that identity and to form that identity because you may depend on them for financial means or emotionally. And you could be kicked out if you come out as queer. However, if you've got a strong social network or perhaps have moved out, that dependence isn't there, and so you can more easily form that identity and be open with that identity and be braver, or not so much, it's not that it's an internal braveness, but it's a safer space to then come out and to disclose that. Because you've got the support of your friends and it's not as big a risk to disclose.
Yeah, we think that every person has the need of belonging, or also the need of feeling connected to other people. So we also think that your access to a specific group or a community also depends on the recognition you have by others or by this group, or also by the validation or the confirmation you get from this group. And this can also go into the direction of that this group can also reject you even though you want to be part of this group. In context of teaching or as an educator, it's important to understand that students have this need of this emotional and social need of belonging, and this need of belonging also shapes their identities. From the perspective of teachers or of educators, we think that teachers today are expected to create a surrounding where students can fulfill their fully potential and thrive, but they are also expected to negotiate boundaries and support the development and practice of ethics and behavioral expectations. So to do so, teachers or educators in general would need an awareness about how complex identities are and how those identities influence their students and also their class and the dynamics in class. However, a lot of educators and teachers are struggling today to understand and also to negotiate the complexity of identities, the whole language around it, and also the needs of the students and basically the structural discrimination and the violence they can face in class in all different kind of forms. What is your experience with labeling?
So there's a big difference between being named and naming myself. And I think that I understand labeling as a mechanism that I know from school experience. So as a teacher myself, I had to work with specific special needs labels in my classrooms. And I was always pretty surprised about what a diagnosis actually means in terms of what a child can't do. And it right off the bat leaves you with a really negative impression of a student without actually knowing them. So I have been questioning the value of labels very much in the sense that they limit my perspective of students. I have encountered one example of a child that was interchangeably labeled with a learning disability or cognitive delay. Depending on which label, there was more lessons with a special educator or less lessons one-on-one, so it's a matter of resource. And yet she was also elected through a class council meeting as the most trusted person in the group. So for me, that really was contradicting the messages that I would have gotten about this child had I only interacted with the diagnosis and with the way that she was portrayed through the medical perspective of what she was lacking. And for me, that was a key moment of really trying to understand a child with its kind of natural ways of being in the classroom and what other resources there are that can be used in order to achieve learning. So in order to engage children with reading, writing, like the basic, the skills and competences that are, you know, important in school. So to me, labeling in that sense is quite a bureaucratic way of administering resources and funding. I do understand also through like the way that schools work that they have a practical reason and that they can help finding out what might be useful for a child in which situation. So I do understand the pragmatisms behind it. It's a debate that has been dominating inclusive or special education for a while, so it doesn't, it's, of course there's debate around it, but yeah, for me labeling is attached to being named as someone, and therefore potentially a concept that is linked to deficit assumptions of students.
I think from the perspective, for example, of affirmative action, there is the idea that there is a deficit, and the deficit might not necessarily lie within the people. Mm-hmm. It might be a deficit that is a social construct. It might, like in the case of affirmative action, it's to counterbalance the devastating effects that slavery and diaspora have had on Black people. Mm-hmm. So there needs to be some kind of reparations or ways to uplift people who have structurally been disadvantaged. So I'm also working as a teacher, and from my everyday experience, I need some kind of reduction of complexity, and I need words to describe the challenges that students face in order to be able to support them adequately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you have any propositions?
It's true. It's true. I do understand that. On the other hand, I think the tradition within which these labels were developed are just a little bit outdated when it comes to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, for example. There's a social model of disability that says it doesn't lie within the individual, but that actually my personal features as well as my surrounding is an interaction with each other, and we have to change the way we school and the architecture of the school and the different techniques of teaching and learning in order to accommodate all of us. However, the way that these special educational needs statuses work is oftentimes still through comparing individuals through a norm and then seeing how these don't fit, and they are also often unfortunately tied to cultural stereotypes, and the reality or the practice of administering them is highly questionable, because we have kids who speak German as a second language or who have a migration history over proportionally administered with learning disability, or in certain special schools that focus on behavior or learning disability. So there are dimensions of racism, classism, ableism, all also need to be considered in order to understand what these special needs services actually do. Do they serve the individual, or do they disable them on top of already existing challenges?
Yeah, I agree with you totally, but there are still some pragmatic worries.
Yeah.
And practical worries also that I have, because I have experienced the destigmatization of disability, and talking that within some circles of special ed teachers, where talking about the disability becomes a kind of taboo, and thereby forcing the disability out of the discourse. And when the disability is, it doesn't matter actually whether the disability is visible or not, but there is sometimes a special treatment needed, because there's a special help needed, and if this is not communicated with the other kids, then conflicts arise from that. Sure. Either the kids get into an opposition with the teacher, or they go into opposition with the kid, and I think this needs to be very carefully mediated by the teacher.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that community building is incredibly important, because the focus, it's it's a justice dilemma in a way, right? You want to administer support because not everyone is the same, simply as that. And at the same time, you want to stress what we have in common. And I think it's a back and forth within the classroom to create moments and practices and events in which we see each other as working together. And at the same time, I might need more time practicing my letters because I've only just arrived in Germany, or it's just a little bit more difficult for me. So I do see that, and it would be wrong, and the taboo is a good example. It would be wrong to pretend that special services aren't needed, and I think the disability rights movement is always trying to navigate where can we not lose our hardly fought for services that actually give us space to develop who we are, and also support us in wherever along the way we are. So I do get that. I just worry about examples of students who think they are limited by what they can do based on the stigma or based on the special need that is tied to stigma. And I always try to tell my students, you only see a small part of your kids every day. There's so much more to them. So don't assume and don't make limit their identities into one way or another in terms of what they cannot do.
I understand and agree with where you're coming from, like the criticism of labeling and the history of labeling and the roots of labeling also in criminology, and like the perpetuation of stereotype and discrimination.
Yeah.
And I think like we both agree on that. But there's also the other part coming in where my experience as an activist and self-advocate comes from the another stream of theory, like the identity politics part of it. Yeah. And there is also in the disability movement the Cripps movement, and other movements that appropriate or reappropriate derogatory terms, or use other forms of identity that don't necessarily have to be derogatory. And so there is this, basically identity politics is the idea of an identification through a shared vulnerability or the shared experience of oppression. And I think although I can follow your argument, I think I'm reluctant to take this away because of the struggles that groups have within the right of self-determination. And I think that's where we come together, because we both fight for the right of self-determination, and but from different sides of the discourse.
Yeah, because I often want to tell my students not to read the diagnosis before they have met the student, because I feel like it's too overpowering to read all the many instances in which they have misbehaved or didn't do certain things the way they should have. And to me, I also think that I always wonder whether it's important or whether children should know their special needs status, and because I fear it becomes, as we've discussed, like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, oh, my diagnosis says I won't be able to read, so why would I even try to? And it doesn't, because I have observed that kids who play with each other and don't necessarily know kind of the labels attached to them through the medical gaze, maybe a little bit more optimistic or just playfully engage with activities that teachers might not, call as instruction and learning and whatever, but learning is so much more than what happens in school, obviously, and it is connected to play. And I think there's creative moments that kids can actually develop their own access to letters and to reading together. And so I would want to have as little restriction on these also accidental moments in education to learn from each other. And I feel like the special needs classroom, the special classes, or a special school runs the risk of community learning in unexpected ways.
I mean, I think none of us would seriously argue for
segregation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because like it's the question of basic human rights, so it's the question about the how, rather than the whether or not.
Yeah.
But I think it's very, very important to take into consideration like the reality of schools, and that's how Danielle also expressed why they chose to be in a segregated school for a part of their school biography. And but while at the same time fighting for the environment to be adapted to their needs, rather than the other way around. Yeah. But I'm because you like we're coming back again and again to labeling, and I just wanted to say that because I've just started with the part of identity politics that is this. The starting point of it is the experience of a shared vulnerability and oppression, but then it continues, and then like you start questioning what is the part of my identity that people use as an excuse to put me down or to treat me poorly. And then in the next step you realize that there are other people who share this experience. They, for the same aspect of their identity, are being treated differently and have the experience of exclusion or exotization or and when you realize this, there can be a lot of power in the realization that you are not alone, and thereby you can regain the power over your own narrative in organizing. And this is something that we've heard in the narratives of Özge and Danielle and Sam, that the organizing in self-advocacy groups gave the feeling of community and also of power. There's an empowering way in identifying with what other people might consider inferior. So, I don't think that there is one solution, but maybe we can have a look at another theoretical framework that might, rather than help us out of this dilemma, show the trilemma of things and give us an analytical framework that helps us navigate the difficulties and the complexities of reality.
Sounds awesome.
What is the trilemma of inclusion?
The trilemma of inclusion is a theoretical model by Mai-Ann Boga, who offers insight into the dynamics of oppressed groups and how they deal with the oppression and fight the oppression in the iterations against it. And so the trilemma, Mai-Ann Boga parts from the idea that the demands or what is demanded of people who are oppressed is very often contradictory. That's why the answers to that are also often contradictory. And this basic idea helps us to stay cool in very, very tense situations as teachers. Because tense situations arise every day, especially when we look at identity, because it touches our core, our sense of self, our self-esteem, our concept of self. That is why they are loaded, these situations, with emotions, such as the situation I've talked about before on in the courtyard, where the kids start shouting at each other. So such a theoretical model can help me to stay cool and have a professional attitude with which I can deal and handle these situations. Professional doesn't mean not emotional. Professional means aware of my own emotions and the existential crisis that kids might be in these moments. Yeah, like Özge and Sam said in the beginning, the identity process is so important for the creation of the self, and there's not only a material but also an existential need for it, and an existential pain when this is threatened or one feels rejected.
So what are the 3 dimensions of the trilemma then?
Yeah, the 3 dimensions of the trilemma are empowerment, normalization, and deconstruction. And the amazing idea in this is, or her amazing finding, because actually Maya Amboga came across the trilemma as a result of her empirical studies. She found out that you can never have the 3 different strategies at the same time. You can have 1, you can have 2, but if you have 2, they automatically exclude the 3rd.
Yeah. To me, because I think I have been trying to tick the boxes, right? I'm so used to working with labels and trying to challenge labels that I forget that there is oftentimes a situation where these cannot be reconciled with each other, and understanding how normalization, empowerment, and deconstruction are really important practices and activities, but they cannot be achieved all at once, is a really big realization for me. And especially thinking through these examples of the speakers that we had, that make us as a group talking about identity and being simply involved in understanding ourselves. And we could start with our 3 speakers and see where we've discovered how they touch on these 3 dimensions. For example, when I listen to Danielle, it's important for me to understand that on the one hand, she wants to simply, she names cerebral palsy as just one of any identity category that make her up. It's not the first one, it's not the most important one about herself. So I would consider that as a way of normalizing, and simply just expanding of our idea what, normal interactions look like. And at the same time, she has a business and creating awareness and disability positivity by designing patterns for her wheelchair, because she doesn't want it to be just black. It's really hot in the summer, it heats up, so she has different patterns that also interact with rainbow colors, and one of them has her in a wheelchair on it, and she's proud of it, and she serves her community by being a voice for other disabled people. So there's empowerment, right? Yeah,
so this would be on the axis of empowerment and normalization, because I guess that her portrait on her wheelchair as a print is a normalization of the fact that people are in wheelchairs, deal with it, and it's empowering because it also looks amazing. It's really cool.
What do we do with deconstruction then?
Maybe I think for deconstruction it's a good idea to use also the example of how we got into the discourse and our discussions, because when we discussed the role of labeling and the role of identity politics in the beginning, we found out actually, because in the beginning we were discussing more controversially, with a bigger controversy. And then we realized that from the historical perspective of special education and the way labeling has been used, and your experience as a special ed teacher and a teacher trainer, you came with a very strong, also almost, or not almost, like literally also activist impetus of deconstructing labels. And then I felt threatened by that, and I went more into the empowerment and normalization position. So this can be very helpful, this experience can be very helpful for teachers to understand that if one person takes one position in the trilemma, you might, or the other person might, whoever that is, a student, a colleague, might take another position because they might feel threatened by the position you have taken. And I think that's something that happened, and that when we understood more and more about the trilemma, that really helped us and gave us a way out, and to say all of the points are valid, but we can't have all of them at the same time. And we have all of them within ourselves as strategies, but not at the same time.
So we also got to know Özge, and she explained how during her school experiences she was viewed as Turkish, although she has developed, or she has a strong identity of being a Kurdish woman. And so she experienced in school teachers who were just adopting discourses and assumptions about her being Turkish. Yeah, I think this example that Özge shared with us shows very well how important it is for teachers to have some kind of knowledge about the complexity of identities, about intersectionality, and about the way discrimination works, because otherwise they knowingly or unknowingly contribute to the discrimination and increase the pressure of assimilation. So it's impossible for teachers to know all the national contexts, to know about like all the kinds of discrimination in Iran, Turkey, Brazil, Ukraine, Vietnam. It's not possible to know everything. But if you have worked through the complexity exemplarily, like if you have had a very complex example and you have worked through it, you might be more able to apply this carefulness, this modesty to other examples. And and the trilemma really can help us to navigate this complexity. Okay. In which ways?
I mean, I think we've talked about quite a few examples, and so here I think with regard to what Özge has shared with us, it is interesting how her like she has some kind of strategic essentialisms, like she identifies with a label that has been assigned to her, the label of a foreigner, that she has rejected and that has worked in oppressive ways. She reappropriates this and makes it into a source of strength and solidarity. And so that is the more general label, but for her she also, and that in the trilemma would be on the axis of normalization and empowerment. But she can't deconstruct the category of foreigner when she is following these axes. But there might be other moments where she deconstructs it. We haven't heard it now, but like we have in other discussions raised these points where we recur to a shared humanity rather than to the empowerment and normalization part.
Yeah, and I was also really moved by the way that Özge explained how important it was that teachers were listening, and that they would actually, when she struggled with identifying as an only working class approach to life, that she was actually able to have teachers point out to her that there is possibilities, that she just does, she can try for different options, and that it is incredibly important to have teachers who believe in you and who see potential, and that it is just important to, when students are on their way, to also grapple with who they are in their own communities, but also within a classroom community, to let people choose their own path and own ways. It comes back to naming and being named. And and it's important to listen to the nuances that students present themselves with, because of course we as teachers can't know everything. Yeah. So also kind of guiding or like just listening to students along the way of deconstructing the labels that they come to school with is a really important exercise.
Yeah. And from her narrative also, her narrative shows how the labels have normalizing or naturalizing effect of the social difference, and at the same time homogenizing effect. So the group subsumed under the label is supposedly homogeneous, and then creates a hierarchy. So this distinction has also been raised in criticisms of nationalism, but it's also we can also adapt it to labels. And then I think that the listening of the teacher becomes so existentially important because it gives you the opportunity to get out of the homogenization. So I am not Turkish, I am Kurdish. What does it mean to be Kurdish? What does it mean to suffer from anti-Kurdish racism? These questions are like Özge said, I wanted to be seen. It was important for somebody to see me. What does this mean to see me? Yeah. I think it means to be able to step out of the homogenizing views of these labels, whether you appropriate them at a later point or not. Right. But to be able to be an individual.
And to label yourself or to identify yourself.
Yeah. To be able to own your own narrative, to appropriate or reappropriate the stories told about you, to be able to influence the stories and the narratives about you. Yeah,
and then to find the people that actually you feel in solidarity with, so you can actually nurture the bonds and the groups of people that you need to feel belonging.
Yeah. And that is like just the final comment, and that is also where the why we approach the topic from different areas. While for LGBTIQ, but especially for trans people, the iteration of their identity is, I don't know whether I want to say label, it's an identity they have to fight for, or we have to fight for, because people want to see us dead. There is like an opposite movement from the area of special education. Yeah. And we can't answer all of the questions because there's obviously the pragmatism that we've also talked about, but look at the trilemma, it can help you.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of All Means All. In the show notes, there is a link to the chapter in the open textbook. There you can find the transcript of the video and more information on the topic.